Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look into the many faces of environmentalism. In the second half of our show, award-winning conservationist and beyond organic farmer Nancy Klein shares a story with a fight to save her fledgling vineyard from destruction by the EPA, the FBI, and the Army Corps of Engineers. Up first, we welcome Patrick Moore, co-founder and former president of Greenpeace, chair of Ecology and Energy for the Frontier Center for Public Policy, and the author of Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, The Makings of a Sensible Environmentalist. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Nice to be with you, Bill.
Patrick, you were the only founding member of Greenpeace with a PhD in ecology, and you helped lead the fight against atmospheric nuclear bomb testing back in the early 1970s. Remind us of that story and the creation of the fabled Rainbow Warrior.
Well, the Rainbow Warrior came a little bit later, actually, but the time that we fought against the nuclear testing was an amazing turning point in human history because it was the height of the Cold War and the threat of all-out nuclear war, World War III was upon us. And it was also the time of the emerging consciousness of the environment. It was the height of the Vietnam War, too. So it was a pretty scary time to be a young person. And I became radicalized by all this while I was doing my PhD in ecology, and joined a small group of people in a church basement in Vancouver, and we set out to stop the hydrogen bomb testing that the United States was doing in Alaska, and ended up helping change the course of history and showing that a small group of people can really accomplish a lot.
And young people don't remember, they used to test H-bombs in the open atmosphere.
Yes, there was atmospheric nuclear testing, like hundreds of atmospheric nuclear tests, until the mid-60s, when the United States, England, and Russia agreed to go underground, but France did not. So they were continuing to test atmospheric hydrogen bombs and nuclear weapons in the atmosphere until the early 1970s, when we intervened. This was after our campaign against U.S. underground hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. And we succeeded in 3 years in driving those nuclear tests underground by publicizing what they were doing. And that was basically the end of the first major phase of Greenpeace, because we went on from there in 74 with the voyage in 75 to save the whales.
Now let's talk about that a little bit, because that's how most people identify Greenpeace. I mean, Save the Whales projected the organization up to about $100 million a year in donations. And with all the problems in the world, what made whales so special?
Well, from my perspective, whales were a symbol for the saving of life from extinction. And the whales were being driven into extinction by these gigantic factory whaling fleets, mainly from Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, and Japan. So we went out on the ocean and got in front of the harpoons and got on TV all over the world.
Right, I remember that.
Because of that, because, it's one thing to carry a picket sign down the street saying, save the whales, but we actually went out and got in front of the harpoons to protect the whales, and that galvanized public opinion in our favor. So the Save the Whales campaign was really the culmination of the awareness of the environment and the need to stop doing things that are going to cause extinction and going to cause real damage to the environment. Besides which, the whales are the largest animals which have ever lived on Earth. They have brains that are bigger than ours. The dolphins and whales are the only group of species whose brains are larger than ours, and they must be doing something with it.
Well, it was quite a compelling story. It galvanized public opinion, and it eventually succeeded.
It did. Factory whaling was banned in the North Pacific in 79, 4 years after we started, and in the whole world in 1981. And it was definitely our intervention, both out at sea and at the International Whaling Convention meetings, which occurred annually, where we helped convince many nations that this should be ended.
Now, next stop after saving the whales, which truly were in danger of extinction, Greenpeace turned to protecting baby seals. I mean, unlike whales, baby seals are as abundant in cows and pigs, which we slaughter without compunction, but boy, they sure are charismatic. How is this campaign similar, and how is it different from Greenpeace's first two causes?
Well, it didn't hurt that the baby seals are beautiful. I mean, everybody gets that.
Oh, great eyes.
The difference between the seals and the whales, whereas the whales represented preventing extinction of a whole range of species, the seals represented a fundamental change in our relationship with wild nature. Because here were people in a modern context. It was one thing when there was no food in the March of the year and people went out there to kill the seals for food. But now they're just killing them for vanity fur in a modern era, wading into the nursery of a wild marine mammal and slaughtering all the young to death while they're still suckling and their mothers are still with them. And so that had more to do with animal welfare, animal cruelty, and just changing our relationship with wild nature. We wouldn't do that with the fawns of deer, for example, when they're still suckling in the spring.
But we do it with veal.
Yes, but that's not a wild animal. That's a domestic animal.
Huh.
And even Jacques Cousteau, for some reason, didn't get that distinction. He said it's no different than an abattoir or a slaughterhouse. But it is different. It's in wild nature. We didn't raise those seals. They are raising themselves independently of us. And so making the distinction between domestic animals being farmed and wild animals being hunted is something that we've done all through history. But for some reason, we thought it was okay to slaughter baby seals while they were still nursing in the breeding colony. But we would never do that with land animals.
Patrick, after all these years, you still seem pretty passionate about it.
Well, I am. And, today Greenpeace characterizes me as some kind of turncoat. But in fact, I still agree with everything we did while I was there, except one thing. And that's, I think we made a serious mistake in not recognizing that nuclear energy was a beneficial use of nuclear technology as opposed to nuclear weapons. And we lumped the two together, whereas we should have put nuclear energy in with nuclear medicine as a good thing to do with nuclear power. And if the environmental movement had been smart and recognized nuclear energy as the way to go, there'd be a lot less coal plants today. Not that I'm against coal plants, but there would be a lot less of them and a lot more nuclear plants, which would mean a cleaner environment.
Well, things took a real turn for you, I guess, when Greenpeace declared war on chlorine. I mean, the organization actually stated that there are no known uses of chlorine which we regard as safe, which is an amazing statement considering how important it is to our municipal water supplies. As one of the only trained scientists in the organization, what did you make of that?
Well, it was because I was the only international director that had a formal science education. The rest of them were in this airy-fairy, there should be no toxins in the world type of thinking.
Yeah.
And of course, the reason chlorine is the most important element for public health and medicine is because it's toxic to bacteria.
Right.
So adding it to drinking water prevented the spread of cholera and other waterborne diseases. It's the biggest advance in the history of public health. And many of our pharmaceuticals, like about 75% of them, are made with chlorine chemistry precisely because the chlorine part of it acts to kill whatever is trying to kill us. And so they just didn't get it. And that was when I really did have to leave. Up until then, we were having some philosophical differences, like I don't think humans are the enemies of the earth, as is now characterized, all the time. In the beginning, we were humanitarian in our orientation to save civilization from all-out nuclear war, and the piece in Greenpeace is about people. But as Greenpeace evolved to the whales and the seals and the toxics campaigns, it lost the piece somewhere along the line, and now all that mattered was the green, and the humans are the enemies of the green. And that's what we teach our children, which is a philosophy I simply cannot accept because we're part of nature. And the first rule of ecology is really that it's all one ecosystem, all interconnected.
Well, it begs the question, save the planet for whom?
Well, for nature, I guess, because there's this impression that nature would be better off without us because we're the enemies of nature. And so this separating humans out it's kind of a bit like original sin in religion, that we're born with evil in us. And yet all the rest of nature is benign or even good.
Noble.
Rather than just neutral. Whereas in the Christian tradition, humans can have a choice whether to be good or bad, but all the rest of nature is perceived as neutral. The deer isn't good or bad. I mean, I guess if a grizzly bear eats your kid, it's bad. But you know what I mean. We don't ascribe evil to other species besides ourselves.
If you can't make a moral choice, you can't be evil.
Exactly. But what environmentalism has done is it's internalized all the evil in humans and externalized all the good into nature. And that is a really bad thing to be teaching our kids because for one thing, it makes them feel like there's no hope for any solution to this situation and that the world is coming to an end. And many of the campaigns are all about that, about how the apocalypse or the catastrophe is coming. It's sort of like, again, like religion with end times.
Patrick, you point out in your book that the anti-development perspective of environmentalists from wealthy, industrialized countries is very different from the pro-development environmentalists from poor, developing countries. How so?
My turning point in Greenpeace was actually about 4 years before I left. I was at a meeting of an international environmentalists from around the world in Nairobi, the 10th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference on the Environment, which was the first UN Environment Conference. And for the first time in my life, I heard the term sustainable development. And a light went on. I realized that my next task was going to be much broader and more difficult than just awareness of the environment. Because sustainable development is about balancing environmental, social, and economic priorities. In other words, taking into account the needs of people as well as the needs of the environment. And that word was minted there because there were environmentalists from the industrialized countries and environmentalists from the developing countries meeting together. And the industrialized country environmentalists were basically anti-mega project, anti-development.
Right, no dams.
Anti-hydro dams, anti-nuclear plants, anti-just about everything that anybody wanted to build. Whereas if you're from a developing country, even as an environmentalist, you can't be against development or they'll laugh you right out of the room. And so the concept of sustainable development was actually a compromise between environmentalists from the rich countries and environmentalists from the developing countries. And it's, of course, been shortened to sustainability now. A lot of people reject it on both sides, but actually it's a very useful term if it's defined carefully as basically satisfying the priorities of environment, society, and the economy simultaneously.
Well, you've stated that poverty is the worst environmental problem.
Yes, and I believe it is. If you go to countries where there's terrible poverty, you don't find a very good environment.
Right.
Because people can't afford to plant trees after they've cut them for firewood or timber. People can't afford to clean the water after they've made it dirty. People can't afford pollution control. People live in mud huts with wood fires and smoke that gives them lung disease at an early age. And so the really big issue in my estimation is to get electricity to people, to get sanitation and health care to people so that they live longer and prosper and end up automatically, therefore, having smaller families. And the fact of the matter is, it really comes down to the mechanization of agriculture in the developing countries to solve the poverty and population growth problem.
Well, you know, after leaving Greenpeace, you decided to take action. You devoted yourself to fish farming as a living example of sustainability. Share a bit of that story with us.
Well, as I was leaving Greenpeace, I found a coffee table book written by a woman from Malta who had worked for a long time in the Law of the Sea process at the United Nations. Elizabeth Mann Borghese is her name. And she talked about seeing the emerging fish farming around the world in the sea. Most fish farming had been done in freshwater with trout and carp and such, going back thousands of years. But in the 1970s, people started farming marine fish, like salmon in Norway. And because I'm from a place in British Columbia where there's a lot of salmon and salmon fishing, this seemed like a logical place to start a salmon farm. And I saw it as a sustainable development because it takes pressure off the wild stocks. You can farm the fish like people started doing with animals 10,000 years ago. And also it employs people in remote coastal communities. And it provides one of the most nutritious and healthy foods in the world at a lower price than the wild fish and all year round because the wild fish is only available fresh seasonally and is usually quite expensive. So salmon farming, along with many other species now that are being farmed, like tilapia, and I see steelhead is now being farmed. It's a beautiful product. This is a sustainable development. And yet, it was only 2 years after I left Greenpeace, I started a salmon farm, found myself as president of the fledgling BC Salmon Farmers Association in the mid-1980s, and being attacked by my old organization, Greenpeace.
Well, yeah, for some reason, Greenpeace and many environmentalists threw in with the ocean fishermen against the fish farmers. I mean, they called for a boycott on farmed fish. Why is this when ocean fishermen were the ones threatening some species and you were making more of them?
Well, it's an interesting convergence of interests, but of course, fishermen have a kind of romantic image around themselves, which is easy to promote, even if they're
fishing out the stocks,
using huge steel boats and modern equipment and electronics and sonar and wiping out a species. Although many fisheries are managed well, like the pollock fishery in the Bering Sea is managed very well. The halibut fishery and crab fisheries off the west coast of Canada and Alaska are managed well. The real problem is in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, where you've got more than 20 countries all vying for the same stocks of fish, and where there's huge subsidies to maintain these fishing fleets. So it's a structural economic problem, but there's no doubt that the farming of fish takes pressure off the wild stocks and produces a healthy food for people on a year-round basis. And it's just another one of the misguided directions, along with being against genetic science in agriculture and being against forestry, which is about the most ridiculous thing to be against because it's the most sustainable of all the renewable industries we have.
Trees grow on trees.
Yes, exactly. Almost everything Greenpeace has done since I left over the chlorine issue has been negative from my point of view, from an environmental and economic point of view. They just seem to have decided that these sort of zero-tolerance, extreme positions are the way to carve out a niche for themselves. They've really just become a giant marketing and fundraising machine with a lot of misguided positions on a lot of important issues.
So, Patrick, the developed world is so much cleaner today than when you and I grew up, yet rather than declaring victory, the environmental movement seems to have become more strident than ever. Global warming is, of course, the great cause they've attached themselves to. They've succeeded in attracting widespread support from politicians and central planners, each with their own agenda. You describe yourself as a global warming skeptic. Why so?
What I'm skeptical about is that global warming is a catastrophe, because we've actually been in a warming trend, one of many that have occurred during the Earth's history, for the last 300 years. The peak of the Little Ice Age was around 1700. The last time the River Thames in England froze over was 1814, as this warming trend has progressed. And we had nothing to do with the peak of the Little Ice Age or the beginning of a warming trend 300 years ago. And that warming trend has been steady in spurts and starts all the way through this 300 years. There's been no increase in the rate of warming. And right now, just in this last 18 years, we have had no statistically significant warming, despite the fact that nearly one-third of all humanity's CO2 emissions have been emitted during that period as it's increasing exponentially in China and India, etc.
Well, speaking of denialism, there seems to be a tremendous effort to deny that there's been a pause in the temperature rise.
Yes, of course there's an effort to deny there's a pause, but the authorities agree that there is one. The UK Meteorological Office, for example, states it clearly that there's been no statistically significant warming. And yet, in the United States, NOAA and NASA have become completely untrustworthy with their numbers and their statements. And it's because they have billions of dollars in federal grants coming in for climate change research. The same thing with the International Panel on Climate Change. Most people don't realize that their mandate is only to investigate human causes of climate change. In other words, they have no mandate to look at the natural causes of climate change that have been happening for hundreds of millions of years with ice ages and all this stuff going on. I mean, the climate hasn't changed hardly at all in the last 100 years compared to how much it's changed in history.
Think about it, yeah. If you look at what's scaring people, are there any climate models that can accurately represent the data that we've got and have ever made a correct prediction about the future?
It's impossible. Even the IPCC recognizes that because it's a chaotic, non-linear system with so many variables, it is impossible to predict the future climate. Simply impossible. Nothing could do it. No computer model could do it. And so they pretend that these models are somehow a crystal ball, which is actually a mythical object. There is no crystal ball. There is no holy grail. These are legends. And so there's this legend that we're able to produce a model that can predict the future climate. This is untrue. We can't. The fact is there is no scientific proof that we are in any way responsible for this gradual 300-year period of warming that followed the Little Ice Age. It's a good thing it didn't keep getting colder, because the Little Ice Age was not a very nice time to be around. That's when the people on Greenland had to evacuate to a person because it became too cold by around 1350. And it didn't stop being cold until 1700.
If you accept the precautionary principle and you say, just in case, let's adopt all the recommendations that the global warming alarmists are making about changing our economy, changing the way we do energy, what impact would it have?
If we stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow, half the population would be dead within a year, and there wouldn't be a tree left on the planet because those who survived would be using them for energy.
And would the climate be saved?
Of course not. I mean, there's no evidence that we're causing any effect to the climate. You see, they say things like the science is settled, the debate is over, as if that's an argument, as if that's evidence. The only evidence we have is that there's been a 300-year warming trend, which is just like the one that happened in the medieval times and just like the one that happened in the Roman times. There's kind of a 500-year cycle been going on over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years of warming and then cooling and warming and then cooling. That's just what nature has been doing. And now we're blaming ourselves for the last 50 or 60 years of it, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it.
So, Patrick, how do we get ourselves out of this public policy dead end?
I have a feeling that it will require people recognizing that actually carbon dioxide was becoming dangerously low. It's got to be turned on its head because CO2 has been decreasing for 150 million years in the Earth's atmosphere. And during the last glaciation, 18,000 years ago, at the peak of it, it went down to very close to the level where plants start to die. We know that plants slowed down tremendously in their growth at 180 parts per million. We have actually saved life from extinction, from a decline in CO2 to a level where life would not be able to survive on the Earth. Because if it wasn't for carbon dioxide, this would be a dead planet. That is a fact. Whereas everybody thinks CO2 is too high and the temperature is too hot, we're in an ice age called the Pleistocene. This happens to be an interglacial period, but this is an ice age. The climate of Earth is colder now than it has been for almost the entire history of life on Earth. There's been other ice ages, but this is one of them.
So, Patrick, what do you recommend?
I recommend that we recognize that human beings are a good thing, and that we recognize that the CO2 we've put into the atmosphere to replenish the CO2 which was taken out by life. Most people don't realize that all the carbon in the fossil fuels came from the atmosphere. It was there in the first place when CO2 was much higher than it is today and life flourished around the world. Those plants out there are actually starving for CO2 at 400 parts per million. They would like 1,000 or 2,000 parts per million for optimum growth. And that is fully proven in science that that is the case. But the warmists fight against all the science that there actually is and pretend that they have science, which they don't, because they would write it down. If there was a proof that CO2 was causing the warming trend, they would write down on a piece of paper their proof. But they don't have it because it doesn't exist.
Patrick, it's so fascinating to hear a contrary voice. Thank you for being on the show.
Nice to be with you, Bill.
That was Patrick Moore, co-founder and former president of Greenpeace, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, award-winning conservationist Nancy Klein from Klein Cellars talks about the challenges of starting and running a beyond organic vineyard in today's hyper-regulated environment. Stay tuned.